The blood had already soaked through his shirt by the time he hit the ground. He did not fall the way strong men were supposed to fall. There was no dignity in it, no last stand, no gripping final moment of defiance. One moment he was standing at the edge of the Ashford borderlands with the cold wind cutting through his coat, and the next, his knees gave out, and the earth came up to meet him with a force that rattled his teeth. He lay there with his cheek pressed into the frost-hardened ground, and for a while he did not move. Not because he was unconscious, but because some part of him was not entirely sure it was worth the effort to try. His name was Callum Dre, and until 4 days ago, he had been the most powerful man in the Northern Territories. The wound along his left side had been given to him not in battle, not by an enemy, but by a man he had shared a table with for 11 years. A man whose children he had helped name. A man he had trusted so completely that the knife had found the gap in his coat before Callum had even understood what was happening. By the time the pain registered, the room had already shifted around him. Hands that should have caught him stepped back instead. Eyes that should have been horrified looked away. He had been removed quietly, in the way that powerful men remove other powerful men when they do not want a scene. No public declaration, no formal exile announced before a crowd. Just a door opened at the back of the estate, and 4 men, who would not meet his gaze, escorting him out into the night, with nothing but the coat on his back and the wound in his side that would not stop bleeding. He had walked for 4 days. He was not sure he could walk a 5th. The borderlands at this time of year were not forgiving territory. The grasses had gone yellow and flat, pressed down by weeks of cold. The tree line to the north was dense and dark, and the sky above it had that particular shade of gray that meant rain was coming, the kind of heavy, slow rain that soaked through everything and did not stop until it had taken something from you. There were no roads out here that anyone respected. There were no houses with lights in the windows. There was nothing, which had been, Callum understood, exactly the point. No one came to the borderlands looking for someone. No one came to the borderlands at all. He had been left out here to disappear. He pressed a hand against his side and breathed through his nose, slow and deliberate. The wound had partially closed on its own over the days, but the way he had landed had pulled something open again. He could feel the warmth of blood through his fingers, too slow to be immediately dangerous, but too steady to be ignored. He needed to stop it properly. He needed something to close it with, and he had nothing. He needed help, and there was no help out here. He closed his eyes. The wind moved over him without sympathy. He did not hear her approaching because she was not approaching from the direction he expected. She came from the east, where the slope of the land dipped slightly, before rising again toward a cluster of birch trees. She was carrying something, a bundle wrapped in rough cloth, and she was walking at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be, but had not yet decided to hurry about it. She noticed him the way a person notices something that does not fit the landscape. She stopped. From the ground, Callum could only see her boots. They were worn, practical, the kind of boots that had been resoled more than once. Then she crouched, and her face came into his line of sight. She looked at him the way he would have looked at a strange bird that had landed on the path in front of him, not afraid, not alarmed, not particularly moved, just observing. Her hair was dark and long, pulled loosely to one side. Her face was composed and still, in the way that faces become still when they have seen enough things to stop being surprised by new ones. She said, "You are bleeding quite badly." He said, "I am aware." She tilted her head slightly. "Can you stand?" He considered the honest answer to that. "With help," he said, "possibly." She set down her bundle, not beside her but several careful steps away, which he registered as a person being practical about the possibility of needing to leave quickly. Then she reached down and offered him her forearm rather than her hand, which was the correct instinct because his hands were wet with blood and she would have lost her grip immediately. He took her arm. She planted her feet and leaned back, and he came up off the ground in a way that cost him something serious, a wave of heat and pressure through his side that made the world go briefly sideways. He held onto her arm until the world steadied, and she let him, standing still and saying nothing while he collected himself. "There is a shelter," she said, when he had straightened, "about 12 minutes from here on flat ground. Not a house, but it is dry." "What kind of shelter?" "The kind you do not ask about," she said, which was a complete answer, as it turned out. She retrieved her bundle and walked slowly enough that he could keep pace with her, which was slower than she probably would have liked, but she did not comment on it. He watched the ground in front of his feet and breathed carefully, and did not speak, because speaking took energy he did not currently have to spare. She did not seem to require conversation. She moved through the borderlands like someone who had done it many times, stepping over the places where the ground went soft, ducking slightly at one point under a low branch that Callum would not have seen in time. The shelter was a structure built into the slope of a low hill, 3 walls of packed stone and a 4th wall that was largely a wooden door, with a roof of old timber and layered sod that had grown over so completely it looked like simply a part of the hillside from any distance. Inside it was dark until she lit a small lantern she kept on a ledge near the door, and then it was dim but warm, insulated by the earth on 3 sides, and a small iron box in the corner that served as a stove, already loaded with dry wood. She got the fire going with a speed that indicated she had done this frequently. The space was small, perhaps 4 strides in each direction, but it was clean. There was a cot against one wall with a folded blanket on it. There was a shelf with several clay jars and a few tools, whose purposes Callum could not immediately identify. There was a bucket of water with a lid on it. She pointed at the cot. He sat on it without being asked twice. She set water to heat on the stove and began going through the jars on the shelf with the deliberate manner of someone taking stock. He watched her. He did not speak. He was trying to decide whether this was the kind of situation that required him to explain himself, or whether she already understood enough not to need it. "You do not have to tell me anything," she said without turning around, as though she had heard the debate in his silence. "I am not going to ask." He let out a breath. "All right." She found what she was looking for in the 3rd jar. A needle made of bone, thin and curved slightly at one end, the kind used for fine repair work. She held it up and examined it in the lantern light, then set it on the shelf and reached up to her hair. He watched, not entirely understanding at first, as she pulled the loose tie from her hair and let it fall around her shoulders. Then she reached into a small fold of cloth near the jar and retrieved a pair of small scissors, the kind used for detail work. She looked at the length of her hair for a moment. She did not hesitate. She cut a section from the underside, close to where it would not show much, and began separating the strands with a practiced precision, selecting the longest and strongest ones, and running them between her fingers to test them. Callum said, "You are using your hair." She said, "I do not have thread." He was quiet for a moment. "I have money," he said, "somewhere." He patted his coat and then stopped because the motion pulled at his side. "Perhaps not on me directly at this moment, but I can pay you back." She looked at him. "I am not doing this because I expect payment." "Then why are you doing it?" She thought about that for a moment, in a way that was not evasive, but genuinely considered, as though she wanted to give him the accurate answer rather than the easy one. "Because you were on the ground," she said finally, "and I was not." She threaded the needle with a steadiness that he found remarkable, considering the light, considering the thickness of the strands, considering that none of this was standard. When she came toward him with it, he did not move back. He had been through enough in his life to know when the thing coming toward him was not a threat. She said, "This will hurt." He said, "I know." She said, "I am going to try to be as quick as I can." He nodded and turned slightly to give her access to his side, and she began. It did hurt. It hurt in the specific, close, unavoidable way that careful work hurts. Not the broad crashing pain of injury, but the fine, precise pain of something being done slowly and correctly. He breathed through it. She worked with concentration, each stitch placed with a care that someone who did not care would not have taken. He watched the lantern on the shelf and thought of nothing useful. She was halfway through when the warmth from the stove had spread far enough through the shelter to reach them both. His coat was off, draped on the edge of the cot, and the cold that had lived in his body for 4 days was beginning, cautiously, to loosen. He had not realized how deeply the cold had settled into him until it started to leave. He looked at the top of her head, bent over her work. The lantern caught the color of her hair, dark brown with a reddish thread in it where the light hit. She was not young in the way people mean when they say young to indicate inexperience. She was the kind of woman who had moved through enough of her life to have found her own way of moving through it, steady and without wasted motion. He did not know her name. He had not asked. She had not offered. She pressed the last stitch carefully, and then tied off the end with a knot so small he could barely see it in the dim light, and she sat back on her heels and looked at her work with the same evaluating expression she had used when she first found him on the ground. "It will hold," she said, "if you do not do anything foolish." He looked down at it. The wound was closed. Neat. Done with her own hair, by lantern light, in a shelter built into a hill in the middle of nowhere. He did not have words that seemed adequate for that, so he did not try to find them. "My name is Callum," he said instead. It was the only thing he had to offer at that moment that cost him nothing and gave her something real. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Nora." Outside, the rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally arrived. It came down steadily against the sod roof with a sound like patience. Inside the shelter the fire burned low and the lantern held its light, and Callum Dre sat on a cot with his wound closed by a stranger's hair and thought about the fact that 3 weeks ago he had been the kind of man who made decisions that moved entire regions of the country, and tonight he was simply a person who was alive because another person had chosen not to walk past. It was a strange thing to sit with. He sat with it anyway. Nora had moved to the far end of the shelter and was eating something from a small container she had taken from her bundle. She offered him some without making a production of it, simply extending the container toward him, and he took it because he had not eaten since the previous morning, and his body had stopped being proud about that particular fact somewhere around midday. They ate in silence. The rain kept on. He thought about the man who had put the knife in him, about the room full of people who had turned away, about the door that had opened onto the dark, and the night that had swallowed him whole. He thought about all of it with the flat, analytical distance that shock sometimes provides, a temporary gift from the body to the mind that keeps everything at a slight remove so that the full weight of it cannot land all at once. He knew it would land eventually. These things always did. But for tonight, there was the rain on the roof, and the warmth of the fire, and the fact that he was alive, and his wound was closed, and there was food in his hand. Tonight, that was more than he had expected to have. Nora finished eating, and put the container away, and lay down on the far side of the cot, with her back to him, and her coat pulled over her, the way a person sleeps when they are used to making do with what is available, and do not consider it a hardship. Within a few minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep. Callum sat with his back against the stone wall, and did not sleep. He was not capable of sleep yet. He was still too aware of his own heartbeat, the careful, present fact of still being alive, in a body that had, for 4 days, been losing its argument with the cold and the open ground. He pressed his hand gently against his side. The stitching held. He had been powerful. He had been decisive. He had built something worth protecting out of nothing, and he had trusted people with that something, and those people had reduced everything he had built to the single act of walking him out a back door in the night. All that power, all that careful accumulation of trust and loyalty and respect, and it had come down to this: a cold shelter, a borrowed cot, the kindness of a woman who did not know him and had not asked. He supposed there were worse things to be reduced to. He watched the fire breathe itself lower and lower, and at some point between that thought and the morning, without deciding to, Callum Dre finally slept. Nora woke before the light changed. She always did. It was one of those habits that had formed so long ago she could not remember a time before it, waking in the dark before the world had committed to becoming the next day, lying still for a moment and listening before she moved. She did this now, eyes open in the dark of the shelter, listening to the rain, which had continued through the night, with the same quiet persistence it had begun with. Then she heard him breathing. She had, in the half-unconscious logic of sleep, nearly forgotten he was there. The reminder landed plainly. She turned her head and found him still against the far wall, sleeping upright with his head tilted back at an angle that would cause him pain in his neck when he woke, his coat drawn around his shoulders. In the very early dark he looked less like a man who had been found bleeding in a field, and more like a man in the middle of a very long road that no one else could see. She studied him for a moment, the way she sometimes studied the borderlands themselves, when she had a few seconds to spare from moving through them, noting what was there without adding her own conclusions. He was tall, even folded as he was against the wall. His face in rest had a quality she recognized, not peace exactly, but the closest thing to peace that a person reaches when they are too exhausted to hold their tension any longer. There was a long line from his jaw to the collar of his coat that had what she could only describe as history in it, the kind of angles that come from years of decisions and weather and something that must have been, once, considerable will. His side rose and fell steadily. The stitching held. She got up without waking him, which required practice she had, and put fresh wood on the stove, and let the shelter begin to warm again. She heated water and made something close to tea with the dried leaves she kept in one of the clay jars, and she sat on the floor near the stove with her cup and thought about the practical situation in front of her. She had found a wounded man on her route and brought him to the shelter and closed his wound. That part was finished. The question was what came next, and the answer to that depended heavily on how quickly he could move and where he intended to go. She did not have resources to maintain a guest indefinitely. The shelter was stocked for one person for short periods, not two people for any meaningful stretch of time. She would need to go out today regardless, wound or no wound beside the stove. She was still thinking through these logistics when he woke. It happened the way she had somehow expected it would, without the usual confusion of someone coming out of deep sleep in an unfamiliar place. His eyes opened and he was immediately, completely alert, his gaze moving around the shelter with a speed that was not frantic but efficient, registering her, registering the stove, registering the door, the shelf, the bucket, a catalog. Then his eyes found hers and stopped. "You were up early," he said. His voice was rough from sleep and from cold, and probably from several days of disuse. "I am always up early," she said. She held up the second cup she had prepared while the first one cooled. Tea, in the loose sense of the word. He straightened from the wall with visible effort, pressing a hand briefly to his side, and came to take the cup from her. He sat on the floor, rather than returning to the cot, close enough to the stove to feel its warmth. She noticed that he chose the position that kept the door in his line of sight. A habit, she thought. A very old one. He drank. She drank. Outside, the rain had softened from last night's steady fall to a lighter touch, the kind that might clear by mid-morning. "How is it?" she asked, meaning his side. "Stiff," he said, "but not sharp. That is an improvement on yesterday." "Do not pull at it," she said, "and do not stretch toward your left side. The strands are strong, but they are not indestructible." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You have done this before." "It was not quite a question," she said, "not with hair. But the principle is the same." He considered this. He had, she noticed, the quality of a person who considers things, rather than simply reacting to them, which was either a sign of intelligence or of a man who had learned through painful experience to slow himself down before speaking. She could not yet tell which. "Where did you learn?" "From my mother," she said. She was practical about what she had available and what she did not. He nodded once, as if this answer made sense to him, in a way that suggested his own understanding of practicality. "My name," he said, "is Callum Dre." She looked at him steadily. She had heard of Callum Dre. She suspected most people in the Northern Territories had, though perhaps not in the same detail. She knew he had held the kind of authority that most people only read about in histories, the kind that is not given but accumulated, carefully and over a long time, through particular choices. She also knew, or had heard enough to suspect, that something had changed in that arrangement recently, though the borderlands were not a place where news arrived quickly or accurately. She said, "I know that name." He watched her. "Most people do." "What they say about you," she said, "is that you were fair. That is not nothing." Something moved across his face that was not quite relief, but was in the neighborhood of it. "That is not the kind of thing that turns out to protect you," he said, "when the people around you decide fair is inconvenient." She had nothing to argue with in that, so she said nothing. They finished their tea. She began going through what she had in the bundle she had been carrying yesterday, taking stock. She had planned to resupply from the cache she kept at the eastern edge of her regular route, and the rain had complicated that timeline. She spread out what she had, a small amount of dried food, a cloth wrapping with a few medical necessities, some cord, a folded map that she had memorized so thoroughly she no longer really needed it, and the items she had been originally carrying to deliver. She looked at all of it with the clear eyes of a person who has learned that sentimentality about supplies costs you in the end. She calculated. "I need to go out this morning," she said. "For several hours. You should stay. Move as little as possible. If you need water, The bucket is full, and the lid keeps it clean. He looked at her with something careful in his expression. You are leaving me in your shelter. Yes. You do not know me. She glanced up from her pack. I know enough. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, without the extra weight of drama or invitation. She had spent enough time judging what was and was not a danger to her that she could usually tell within the first few minutes of an encounter whether a person required her wariness or simply her attention. He required the latter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Why did you build a shelter out here? In the borderlands? She looked at him. It was a fair question, and she had several answers to it, some of which were true, and some of which were less true, and some of which were complicated enough to take more time than she currently had. She picked the one that was simplest and most accurate. Because there are places where you sometimes need somewhere to be, that no one is looking for you, she said. And the borderlands are good for that. He absorbed this. You come out here often. Often enough that the shelter made sense. She finished packing, tied the bundle, and pulled on her outer coat. He had not moved from beside the stove, but he was watching her with that same efficient attention he had woken with, taking in the way she prepared to leave, noting details she was not actively trying to hide, but was also not advertising. She put her hand on the door. There is food on the second shelf. The bread is harder than it should be, but it is edible. Eat something before I get back. Nora, he said. She looked back. He seemed to think for a moment about what he wanted to say, and whatever first occurred to him, he let pass. What he said instead was, Thank you, for last night, for all of it. She looked at him steadily. She did not say it was nothing, because it was not nothing, and she had no interest in pretending otherwise. She did not say it was no trouble, because some of it had been trouble, and she had chosen it anyway, which was a different thing entirely, and more honest. She said, The stitching will need checking when I get back. Try not to give me more to do than I already expect. And then she went out into the rain. The morning air hit her as it always did out here, clean and sharp and indifferent to whatever she was carrying into it. She set her face toward the east and moved. She was gone for a little over 3 hours. She went to the cache first, restocked what she needed, made the delivery she had originally set out to make to a small community at the edge of the eastern ridge that depended on her for certain things she did not advertise, and they did not ask her to explain. She did what was needed there quickly, and without the usual amount of conversation, because the rain was picking up again, and she was already thinking about the shelter, and the man in it, with a stitched wound, and a past she had only begun to understand the shape of. On the way back, she thought about what she knew about Callum Dre. She knew his name, as she had said. She knew the territory he had administered, and something of his reputation, which had reached even the people who lived at the edges of things, which was saying something. She knew there had been talk, not long ago, of a decision he had made that had upset the balance of something large, though the specifics of that story had arrived to her in fragments too incomplete to assemble into a clear picture. She did not know who had put the knife in him. She did not, she realized, particularly need to. The wound was what it was. The situation was what it was. The rest of it was his to carry. She also thought, as she walked, about his hands. She had noticed them the night before while she worked, the way a person notices the details that are close to them during careful work. They were large hands, proportionate to the rest of him, with the kind of wear on them that came from actual use rather than performance. There were old scars she had not asked about and would not. There was ink staining the side of one finger that might have been from a pen used regularly and habitually, the kind of mark that came from years of writing, of correspondence, of decisions put to paper. A man who had led with his hands as well as with whatever authority he had held. She noted this and put it away and kept walking. When she returned to the shelter and pushed open the door, he was exactly where she expected him to be, near the stove, but he had moved from the floor to the cot, and he had found the bread on the second shelf. He had also, she noticed, straightened the interior of the shelter with a care that she had not asked for. The cot was made. The cups from the morning were rinsed and set upright on the shelf. The wet mud from his boots, which he had tracked in when she helped him through the door last night, had been wiped from the floor with the corner of a cloth. He had done it slowly and carefully, limited by his wound, but he had done it. She set her pack down and looked at the shelter, and then at him. He said, I needed something to do with my hands. She said, Your hands should be still. The floor needed to be dealt with. She shook her head slightly, but she did not pursue it. She crossed to where he was sitting and crouched to look at the stitching. It was intact. She pressed one finger very gently to the area around it, feeling for heat, for the swelling that would indicate the beginning of something more serious than a closed wound. There was some warmth, which was expected, and some tenderness, which he registered but did not remark on. "It looks correct," she said. "But you need to eat more than bread." I did eat the bread. And it was, as advertised, harder than it should be. She almost smiled. She was not sure he caught it, because she turned toward the shelf before it fully arrived. She began preparing something from what she had brought back, nothing elaborate, but better than what had been available that morning. He watched her work with the same quiet attention he seemed to bring to everything. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She kept her hands moving. "You can ask." "The people you were delivering to this morning, east of here." She said nothing. "I am not asking who they are," he said. "I am asking if they are all right, if you got there safely." She paused and looked at him over her shoulder. It was an unexpected question. Not who or what or why, not the details she protected, but simply whether she was all right. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and returned to looking at the stove. She stood there for a moment with a jar in her hand, and something she could not immediately categorize sitting in her chest. Then she turned back to the shelf and finished what she was doing. The afternoon light, when it finally came, was the thin gray kind that barely qualified as light, but was better than nothing. It came through the small gap above the door and lay in a line across the floor of the shelter. They ate together, the second meal they had shared, and she learned something small but significant about him, in the way he ate, carefully, without rushing, with the awareness of a man who had not had enough recently, but was not going to perform desperation over the fact. He had, she thought, a particular kind of composure. It was not the composure of someone who did not feel things. It was the composure of someone who had decided not to let feeling show through, except when they chose it. She wondered what it would look like when he chose it. The thought arrived, and she noted it and set it aside in the way she set most things aside, in a place that was neither discarded nor examined yet, simply held. After they ate, he asked her how long she had been working the borderlands. She told him 6 years. He asked if she had chosen it. She said yes and no, which was the most honest answer. He said he understood that kind of answer. She believed him. He woke on the second morning able to breathe without it costing him. That was not a small thing. For the 4 days before Nora had found him, every breath had required a degree of effort that became, after a while, its own kind of exhausting. The cold had something to do with that. The wound had something to do with that. The knowledge of what had happened, pressing down like physical weight from the inside, had most to do with it. But that second morning, with the stove already warming the shelter, and the faint evidence of Nora somewhere in the room, from the sound of a jar being set back on a shelf, he breathed in, and the breath simply arrived, without argument. He lay still for a moment, and noticed it. "You slept longer," Nora said. She did not say it as though it was a problem. "I did," he said. He sat up, and the motion pulled at his left side, but not badly. A reminder rather than a warning. He pressed his hand there briefly, feeling the stitching through the fabric of his shirt, the slight roughness of the hair thread against his palm. He thought, not for the first time, about the particular strangeness of that. He had been patched together with pieces of another person. It was intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with closeness, and everything to do with trust. The specific trust of letting another person repair you. Nora had her back to him, doing something at the shelf. She was wearing a dark green coat over a heavier shirt, her hair loose this morning, not cut but falling past her shoulders in the way it had when she had been working on him by lantern light. He could see the place where she had cut from it, not obviously, but there if you knew where to look. A section slightly shorter than the rest, close to the underneath where it would not show from a distance. He had thought about that cut more than he expected to. She turned and held out a cup, and he reached for it, and their hands did not touch. She was precise in her movements in a way that was not unfriendly, but simply careful. And he drank, and the heat moved through him, in a way that felt, today, like something welcome, rather than just something necessary. "How does it feel this morning?" she asked, meaning the wound. "Better than yesterday." "Show me." He lifted his shirt on the left side. She crossed to him and crouched and examined the stitching with the same focused expression she had worn while placing it, running her fingertips very lightly along the skin beside the closed line of the wound, checking the temperature of the surrounding area. Her fingers were cool, and her touch was neither hurried nor unnecessarily prolonged. "The redness is down," she said. "That is what I wanted to see. Is the hair strong enough to hold if I move more?" She looked up at him. "What kind of moving?" "I do not mean anything strenuous. I mean walking. Short distances. I cannot spend another day on the cot." She considered this for a moment, not dismissing it. "Short distances," she said. "If you feel any sharp tightening, you stop immediately and come back. No argument." He nodded. "I mean that," she said. "No argument." "You have a very specific understanding of the word argument," he said. "I have a very specific understanding of what a reopened wound looks like," she said. "That is not something you want an education in." He believed her. She went back to her work, and he dressed slowly, more carefully than he had dressed in years. The deliberateness was useful, in an unexpected way. It forced him to be present, in a way that he had not been, he realized, for longer than the last 4 days. He had been moving at a speed for years that did not leave much room for deliberateness about anything, that treated every action as a necessary step to the next action, and barely noticed the space between. He noticed the space now. He put on his coat and stood at the door for a moment, hand on the wood, and then pushed it open and stepped out. The morning was clear. That surprised him. Yesterday had been gray and wet all day, and he had expected more of the same, but overnight, something had shifted, and the sky was now that hard, particular blue, that only appeared after heavy rain had washed everything else out of the air. The borderlands stretched out before him, yellow grass and black earth and the distant tree line that had looked threatening in the dark of his first night, and now looked simply like what it was, a cluster of trees at the edge of the world. He walked slowly, maybe 30 steps, and stopped. The feeling that arrived was not what he expected. He had expected the ground to feel unstable after 2 days largely horizontal, but it did not. He felt, instead, very precisely where he was. The specific cold of the air, the specific quality of the light, the specific sound of nothing much beyond the wind, across the grass, and a bird somewhere he could not locate. He had been in many beautiful places in his life, places chosen and arranged for their effect on the people present, rooms with views, carefully managed landscapes, and this was none of those things. It was simply honest. It looked exactly like what it was. He stood there for a while. He was thinking about the man who had put the knife in him, as he thought about him most of the time now. But this morning the thinking had a different quality. It was less raw than it had been, less close. He was beginning to be able to examine it the way you examine something once the temperature of it has dropped enough to touch without burning. He could look at it more fully now. His name was Gerald Wren, the man who had done it. Gerald Wren, who had been with him for 11 years, who had understood the operation of everything Callum had built better than almost anyone else, who had a daughter named Clara who was 7 years old, and who had once asked Callum, at a family gathering, why he did not have a dog. He had said he did not have time. She had looked at him with the serious eyes of a child who does not accept an insufficient answer, and said, "You could get a small one." He had laughed. Gerald had laughed. It had been a good afternoon. He thought about that afternoon now, and the thinking did not make him bitter, which surprised him. It made him sad. There was a difference. Bitterness was a thing you aimed outward. This was something that simply sat in him like a weight, the sadness of having believed in something that turned out to be less than he had thought. He had trusted Gerald, because Gerald had seemed to want what Callum wanted, or near enough to it, the stability of the territory, the fair administration of things that required administering, the kind of careful, unglamorous work of keeping something functioning that was too easy to take apart, and too hard to rebuild. But somewhere along the way, without Callum seeing it in time, Gerald had decided that what he wanted was more than that, and what he wanted specifically was for Callum not to be in the position he occupied. The refusal of the order had given him the moment he needed. Callum pressed his hand against his side, not because it hurt but from the pressure of the memory. He had been asked to remove a man from a position he had held for 20 years. Not dismiss him, remove him completely, which in the language they used meant something that could not be undone. The man had not done anything that justified it. He had only become inconvenient to certain arrangements that certain people found profitable. Callum had said no. He had said it clearly and without qualification. He had said he would not do that to a man who had done nothing wrong, and if the alternative was losing his own position, then that was a trade he was willing to make. He had not expected the knife. That was the part he could not entirely reason his way around. He had known his refusal would cost him something. He had known positions could be lost, that trust could turn, that the people around power tended to arrange themselves in the direction that power moved. He had accounted for a version of losing. He had not, somehow, despite 11 years of evidence that the world was not particularly concerned with fair treatment, believed that Gerald Wren would put a knife in his side at close range, while the other men in the room looked at the floor. The belief had been naive. He could see that now. But it had been a genuine one, and something in him did not want to simply discard it, because the alternative was becoming a man who expected betrayal from every direction and arranged his life accordingly, and he did not want to be that man. He had seen what those men became. He did not want it. He turned back toward the shelter. Nora was standing a few steps from the door, looking at him. She had not come out to check on him, or if she had, she was disguising it well, as simply being in the process of going somewhere. She had her bundle with her. "You went farther than 30 steps," she said. He had not counted. "Probably," he admitted. She looked at his side, and? Fine. Sharp in one moment, maybe 15 steps out, but it passed. She made the face she made when something was technically acceptable, but not entirely what she had wanted. "Come in," she said. "Eat something and then you can go out again if you need to." He followed her back inside, ducking slightly at the door. "You are very good at giving instructions." "Someone has to be," she said. She did not say it with any edge. She said it the way someone states a practical fact about how things have come to be arranged. He ate. She prepared to go out again. He had begun to understand that she had a regular route, a set of things she moved between and through, that the shelter was a point on a longer line rather than a destination in itself. He had also begun to understand that her work, whatever it was, involved other people, but not in a way she could easily explain, and he had sense enough not to press. "The people you help," he said while she was packing, "is it always this far out?" She glanced at him. "Not always." "Do they know your name?" "Some of them," she said, "the ones that need to." He nodded. He understood compartmentalization in that sense. He had lived inside it for years, knowing which parts of what he did could be named in which rooms. "How long have you been doing it alone?" She paused for just a moment. Then she said, 6 years is what I told you. But it started before that. Different work, different people. So longer, in practice. He looked at her. "And before that?" She did not answer immediately. She buckled the top of her pack with the efficient motion she used for most physical tasks, and then looked at him steadily. "Before that," she said, "I lived inside a life that belonged to someone else's decisions, and then I stopped." He sat with that for a moment. "Did you choose to come to the borderlands, or did it choose you?" "Both," she said, which was the same answer she had given the day before, and he found that comforting in a way he could not entirely explain, that she was consistent, that the things she said yesterday matched the things she said today. He spent the hours of her absence thinking, which was what he had available to him, and which was, he supposed, not a bad use of enforced stillness. He thought about the situation he was in, practically, about what options existed for a man in his position, which were, at present, limited. There were people who might be willing to help him if he could reach them. People who had their own reasons for wanting the arrangement in the North to be different from what it had just become. But reaching them required movement, and movement required him to be more recovered than he currently was, and being more recovered required time. He had time, uncomfortable amounts of it. He thought about what he would do if he could do anything, not just in terms of recovering his position, which was a strategic question with strategic answers, but in a broader sense. What did he want his life to look like once this was done, if it was ever done? What had he been building toward, and was it still what he wanted? Or had the events of the past week revised something in him that he needed to account for? He did not arrive at answers. But the questions themselves felt more honest than the ones he had been asking himself for the past several years, which had been almost entirely about tactics, about positioning, about the management of things and people in a way that produced desired outcomes. Those questions had been useful, they had been necessary, but they had also, he could now see, crowded out different questions that he had not given enough attention to. Nora came back in the mid-afternoon, with her pack slightly lighter than it had been, and something in her expression that was difficult to read, a quality she consistently had, that he found both interesting and, he admitted to himself, slightly frustrating, in the way that closed things are frustrating when you are trying to understand them. "Everything all right?" he asked. She set her pack down. "Yes." Then, which surprised him, "The people I check on, one of them is not doing well. She is older, and the cold is hard for her this year. I will need to go further tomorrow." He looked at her. She had not said this because she wanted sympathy. She had said it because it was a fact that affected tomorrow's plan, and he was in her shelter, and she was being straightforward about how her plans were being shaped. "Is there anything I can do?" he said. She glanced at him with that evaluating look she had. "Not in your current condition." "I am improving." "You are improving faster than I expected," she said, which he suspected was the closest she came to a compliment, when she wanted to be accurate rather than generous, but not fast enough for a hard day tomorrow. He nodded, and did not push it. "Then I will be here, and I will try to be a less inconvenient guest than I am currently being." Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. It was gone before he could be sure of it. "You are not inconvenient," she said. "You are unexpected. Those are different things." He sat with that for the rest of the evening, the fire burning between them and the cold outside the door, doing what cold did, pressing in at the edges. He thought about what it meant to be unexpected in another person's life. About the way Nora moved through the borderlands as though she had built her world carefully and exactly, and he had arrived in the middle of it unplanned, bleeding, requiring things she had not budgeted for, and she had not walked past. He still could not fully account for that. On the third morning, his hand caught her wrist. It happened the way most significant things happened between people who were not yet sure what they were to each other, quickly, from instinct, before the mind could involve itself and complicate the matter. She had come to check the stitching the way she had the previous 2 mornings, crouching beside where he sat on the cot, and pressing her fingers gently along the edge of the wound. He had been watching her face as she worked, the particular quality of her concentration, the small line that appeared between her eyebrows when she was being precise about something. He had let his gaze travel down to her hands. He saw them properly for the first time, not in the way he had noticed them the night she stitched him, which had been a practical noticing, a recognition of skill and care in the way she moved. This was different. The light in the shelter was better this morning, clearer, and he could see what hours and hours of the kind of work she did had done to her hands. The skin at the tips of her fingers was worn and dry. There was a scar at the base of her right thumb that was older than anything she had done in the last week. The knuckle of her index finger on the left hand had a quality he recognized from men he had known who had worked with their hands in cold weather for years. And then he saw, across the pad of her right forefinger, a series of small red marks. Not a rash, not a scrape. They were the specific pattern left by a needle that had been used many times from the same grip. Made last night, he realized. Made while she worked on him. The needle marks from stitching his wound were on her hands. He caught her wrist before he had decided to. His hand closed around it gently, not stopping her, not pulling her away, simply holding. She went still. She did not pull back. She looked at his hand on her wrist, and then she looked at him. He turned her hand over, slowly, so that the marks on her fingertip faced upward. He looked at them. She did not say anything. She let him look. He pressed his thumb very lightly across the marks, not with pressure, just tracing them. The evidence of hours of work, of the specific cost she had paid, with her hair, with her sleep, with the skin of her hands, to close a wound in a man she did not know, and had had no obligation to. He said, "How long did it take you?" She understood what he was asking. "About an hour and a half," she said. "You were in worse condition than you might have thought. The wound was deeper in one section." He released her wrist. He did it slowly, the way you put down something you are not certain about relinquishing. She moved her hand back to where it had been, and continued what she had been doing, checking the stitching, but she was not entirely the same as she had been a moment before. He could see it in the slight shift of her shoulders, the adjustment that happens in a person when they have been seen in a way they were not quite expecting. "You should have woken me," he said, "when it was worse than expected." She glanced up. "You were unconscious." I woke. Later, she said. By that point, the difficult part was finished. He sat with that. She had worked through the difficult part without him even aware that there was more difficult than he had assumed. He had been lying there in whatever dark, exhausted place his body had sent him to, and she had been doing something that required significant care with her own hands, at cost to herself, in the cold, by lantern light. Nora, he said. She was still focused on the stitching. The wound is healing very well, she said. Better than I expected at this point. You must have been strong before this, or you would not be recovering this quickly. Nora, he said again, and the second time had a different quality than the first, and she heard it, because she looked up. He looked at her directly. Thank you. She held his gaze for a moment. He had noticed, a particular way of receiving things she was not sure what to do with. She went very still, not uncomfortably still, just waiting, as though she was giving herself the space to understand the thing before she responded to it. You already thanked me, she said. Not correctly, he said. I said the words, but I said them before I understood what they were thanking you for. This is different. She searched his face for a moment. Whatever she found there seemed to settle something in her, some question she had been holding without asking. She nodded, once. It was not done for thanks, she said. I know, he said. That is what makes it worth thanking you for. She sat back from the cot and stood, the way she often stood when she was about to move to the next practical thing, putting the conversation behind her, not because it had not mattered, but because she seemed to have a limited number of places where she could hold things at once, and she managed them carefully. Eat, she said, and then you can walk farther this morning if you want to, within reason. What is reason? You will know when you reach it, she said. It feels like the place where sharp becomes uncomfortable. He stood carefully, and she did not help him, which he understood by now was not indifference but respect. She had assessed on the first morning that he could manage without physical assistance, and she had acted on that assessment consistently since. He found he valued it. He had spent years in rooms where people anticipated his needs with a care that was in itself a kind of management, that kept him slightly removed from the direct experience of things. This was different. She let him be where he was. He went out. The morning was cold but not harsh, a thin sun cutting sideways through the tree line to the east and laying long shadows across the grass. He walked farther than he had the previous morning, slowly, with his hands in his coat pockets and his attention on the feel of the ground underfoot and the sound of the wind across the flat. He was thinking about Gerald Wren again. He had found that he could now think about the whole sequence of events with more clarity than he had been able to manage while it was still happening. Distance did that. Even a very short distance. 3 days in a shelter in the borderlands had given him something he had not been able to find in the middle of everything, a place outside of it from which to look at it. He thought about the order he had been given, and his refusal of it. He did not regret the refusal. He would refuse it again. He knew that with absolute certainty, which was the kind of certainty that was worth knowing about oneself. There were decisions in his past that he had made under pressure, and later examined with discomfort. Choices he had made for practical reasons that he was not entirely proud of. Compromises he had accepted because the alternative seemed less manageable at the time. But the refusal of that order was not one of those. He had looked at what was being asked of him, and he had said no, and the no had been correct. What he was still working through was what came after the no. He had understood a cost would come. He had not understood how immediate it would be, how completely the ground would shift in one evening, how quickly 11 years of trust could become something else entirely. He had thought there would be more time, some process, some version of things that moved at a speed that allowed him to respond. There had been no time. There had been one evening and a back door. He was walking with his hand pressed gently against his side, the habit he had developed since the wound, and he was aware that the stitching against his palm was a specific kind of reminder, not of what had been taken from him, of what had been given to him 3 days ago by a woman who had no reason to give him anything. He thought about what Nora had said when he asked her why she had helped him. She had said it was because she could not walk past a man left to die. He thought about how cleanly she had said it, without qualification, without making it more than it was or less than it was, just the honest reason. He had spent years in rooms where honest reasons were not the thing people said, where the reason behind the reason was always the more important thing, where you learned to hear what was underneath the words rather than the words themselves. He had become very good at that particular kind of listening. He had thought it was an essential skill. Standing here in the borderlands with the cold wind moving over him, he was not as sure. Maybe honesty was also a skill. Maybe the ability to simply say the true thing, plainly, without the extra layer of strategy, was not naivety, but a kind of precision. The kind of precision that required more courage than the other sort. He walked back toward the shelter when his side told him he had found the boundary she had described. Sharp, becoming uncomfortable. He stopped exactly there, and stood for a moment, and breathed, and then he turned back. She was at the door when he approached, not waiting for him, not obviously, but present. She had that quality of being somewhere without making her presence into a statement. She stepped back to let him through, and then followed. "You found the limit," she said, not a question. "As instructed," he said. He sat. She had food already on the small surface she used as a preparation area, and she was dividing it with the same efficiency she brought to everything, 2 portions, equal, set on the flat clay plates she kept on the middle shelf. He watched her and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You ask that every time before you ask," she said. "You do not need the preamble." He considered that. "All right, the man I told you was removed, the one the order was about. Do you understand why they wanted him gone?" She brought the plates to where they would eat, setting his down in front of him and keeping hers in her hand. She sat across from him. "Not specifically," she said, "but in general. When someone becomes inconvenient to an arrangement, the arrangement moves to remove them. It is rarely more complicated than that. You understand this kind of politics. I understand that people with things to protect will do significant things to protect them," she said. "That is not limited to political territory. It applies everywhere there is something worth having." He nodded. "The man they wanted removed. His name is Owen Carr. He has worked his position honestly for 20 years. He has never taken more than was appropriate, never made the kind of arrangements that benefit one person at the expense of many, never ignored the things that needed attending to. And he became inconvenient because a set of people wanted to use his part of the territory for purposes he would not allow." She listened without interrupting. "I knew," Callum said, "when I was asked to remove him, what would happen after, the new arrangement that would go into his place, who would benefit, which corners would be cut, which agreements would be quietly set aside, which people would find themselves with less protection than they had before. I knew all of it." He paused. "And I still believed, going into that room, that the people in it would ultimately make the right decision if someone made the argument clearly enough." She looked at him. "You believe that after 11 years of working inside that system?" He heard what was in the question. It was not harsh. It was an honest inquiry. "I did," he said, "which tells you something about me that is not entirely flattering." She thought about this. "Or it tells you something about the specific kind of hope that keeps reasonable people from becoming cynical before their time," she said. He looked at her across the dim space of the shelter. "Both things can be true," she said. "It can be naive and also worth holding on to, at the same time." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You are, for someone who lives in the borderlands, far away from most of the things we are discussing, very clear-sighted about them." "I did not always live in the borderlands," she said. He had known there was more there. He did not push it. He picked up his food and they ate, and outside, the day moved past them with the slow, unhurried indifference of the borderlands, which did not know, or care, who either of them had been, or what had been done to them, or what they might become. It was simply there, the flat ground and the cold air and the sky above, waiting for neither of them, and available to both. That night, the fire lower than usual, and both of them quieter than either of the previous evenings had been. She said something that caught him without his guard. She said, "You will go back." He looked at her. "What?" "When you are well enough," she said, "you will go back. Not because you want the position back, though perhaps you do, but because Owen Carr is still there, and the arrangement they put in place is still in place, and you know what it is doing. You will not leave that alone." He held her gaze. She was looking at him with the same clear eyes she brought to everything, not predicting, not presuming, just saying a thing she had concluded and felt was worth saying. He said, "Is that what you see?" "Yes," she said simply. He sat with it for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. Probably. She nodded once, as though this was the answer she had expected, and looked back at the fire. And he thought that this was the most particular thing about Nora, that she saw things accurately, and said them plainly, and then let them sit without pressing, without using them, simply offering the truth, and allowing him to do with it whatever he was going to do. He pressed his hand against his side. The stitching held. He would go back. She was right. He had known it somewhere underneath every other thought, but hearing it said aloud in that quiet voice, in that small shelter, had something different from knowing it alone. It became real in a way it had not been before. He was going to go back, but he was not ready yet. On the fourth day, the older woman Nora had mentioned needed her, and Nora was gone before full light. She had said the night before that this visit would take most of the day, possibly into the early evening. She had been matter-of-fact about it, the way she was matter-of-fact about most things, but there was something in the set of her mouth that told him the situation was more serious than she was saying. She had left with her pack and her coat, and the small medical kit she kept in the third clay jar, the one with the tightest lid, and the shelter had become, in her absence, a different kind of place. He had noticed this already on the previous mornings when she went out for her regular hours, but those absences had been short enough that they had not fully registered. This one was going to be long, and he sat with it, and found himself examining what the difference was. It was not that he required her company. He had spent years operating largely alone in the interior of his own head, and he knew how to manage the hours of a day without needing another person to fill them. The shelter was warm, and he had food, and his wound was healing well, and there was nothing materially missing. The difference was something harder to name. The shelter itself felt different when she was in it. Not because she talked constantly, she rarely talked unless there was something worth saying, but because her presence had a quality that changed the atmosphere of a space, in the way that certain people change the atmosphere of a space, not through effort or intention, but simply by being the kind of person they were. He had been around many people in his life whose presence was about performance, about the effect they intended to produce. Hers was not like that. She was simply in a room, and the room was different for it. He sat with this observation for a while, and then, because sitting with it was beginning to feel like the kind of thinking that did not go anywhere useful, he stood up and did something practical. He began inventorying the shelter. Not intrusively, he was not going through her things or looking at what she had that she had not shown him. He was looking at what was there in the same way a man looks at a situation to understand it better. The structure of the walls, which were expertly built for someone who was not a builder by trade, or perhaps she was. He did not actually know what her full range of skills was. The way the shelves were arranged, with the heaviest items at the lowest point, and the things needed quickly at eye level. The placement of the stove, which was not in the center of the room but offset toward the north-facing wall, which was the coldest wall, and therefore placed to counteract the cold rather than simply warm the open space. Clever. He looked at the tools on the highest shelf, the ones he had not asked about on the first night. There were 6 of them. 3 he recognized immediately. The 4th looked like something used in the repair of leather, a curved implement with a blunted edge. The 5th was something he needed to look at twice before understanding. It was for setting bone. He had seen the equivalent in the hands of men who worked in difficult terrain far from medical resources. A field tool. Something you carried because sometimes the alternative was leaving a person with an injury that would not right itself on its own. The 6th he did not know, and did not try to determine from looking. He thought about the woman who owned these things, who had built this shelter herself, or near enough to herself, who moved through the borderlands with knowledge that was not theoretical, and who helped people who could not easily be helped by other means, and who had not, in 4 days, offered him a single piece of false reassurance, or said a single thing she did not mean. She had said, on that first night, that she had helped him because she was not on the ground when he was. He had accepted that explanation because it was plainly given, but he had not stopped thinking about it, because it was true, and it was also not entirely complete. There were people who would have passed him on that path and told themselves the same thing, that they were not responsible, that it was not their concern, that someone else would come. There were people who would have seen a bleeding man of uncertain origin in the borderlands and read the situation as threat before they read it as need. Nora had not done either of those things. She had simply seen a person who required help, and she had helped. He could not fully account for the kind of character that produced that response without effort, without calculation, without any apparent need to weigh the cost against the return. He had known people who were generous because it made them feel a certain way about themselves. He had known people who were generous because they had more than enough, and it cost them nothing. He had known very few people who were generous in the way that cost them something real, and did not mention the cost. He sat back down on the cot. The stove was doing its work, and the shelter was warm, and the wind outside moved over the sod roof with a low, continuous sound that was, he realized, almost comfortable. He had not felt comfortable anywhere in recent memory. His thoughts moved to Owen Carr. Owen was a compact, precise man in his late 50s who had taken the position 22 years ago. Not the 20 Callum had said to Nora. He had miscounted by 2. And who had spent those years doing exactly what he had said, running his portion of the territory with the kind of patient, unglamorous thoroughness that large systems required but rarely rewarded. He kept records that actually reflected what had happened, rather than what the people in charge of the records wished had happened. He addressed complaints. He attended to small problems before they became large ones. He was not exciting. He was not brilliant in the way that people meant when they wanted to be impressed. He was simply reliable and honest. And in the end, that had been what made him inconvenient. The men who wanted his territory, Callum had known most of their names for years, had interests that required the kind of flexibility that Owen would not provide. Not because Owen was stubborn, but because Owen had a simple system. He asked whether something was right or wrong before he agreed to it. That system had worked for 22 years. It had also, eventually, made him a problem. Callum had gone into the meeting expecting to argue. He had not gone in expecting to lose in the way he had lost. He had known that his relationship with Gerald was fraying at the edges, had sensed for perhaps a year that something was shifting in the man, that certain conversations were being cut short, and certain information was being withheld. But he had attributed this to the ordinary friction of a long working relationship under pressure. He had not seen the full picture. He now had, as a result, a great deal of time to see the full picture. Gerald wanted the territory itself, not just a piece of it. The whole arrangement. He had been working toward it for longer than Callum had understood, building his own relationships with the men who wanted Owen removed, making promises about what he could deliver that required Callum to either agree or become an obstacle. When Callum had refused, he had completed the transition from colleague to obstacle in the minds of everyone in that room. The knife had been Gerald's way of ensuring the obstacle did not simply regroup and return. He had not done the calculation correctly, Callum thought. He had assumed that a man exiled and wounded and without resources was a man finished. He pressed his hand against his side. The stitching held, steady and precise. He was not finished. The thought arrived without drama, without the heightened feeling that would have come with it a week ago, without the surge of anger that might have colored it and made it into something theatrical. It arrived simply, quietly, as fact. He was not finished. He would recover. He would make his way back through the borderlands to the people who needed to know what had happened. He would make the case for Owen Carr's protection. He would dismantle what Gerald had built, carefully and completely, because it was wrong, and because the people who depended on that territory deserved better than what they were about to receive. He would do this, but not today. He lay back on the cot and stared at the low ceiling of the shelter and breathed, and the afternoon moved over him without asking anything of him, which was something he had not had in years, and which he was, he discovered, more grateful for than he would have expected. Nora returned before dark, which he had not entirely been sure of, and which he had not admitted to himself he had been waiting for. She came in with the specific quality of exhaustion that came from a long, emotionally demanding day. Not the physical exhaustion of hard work, but the deeper kind that came from pouring yourself into someone else's difficulty for hours. He recognized it. He had felt it himself at the end of certain days that had required not just effort, but sustained attention to something that mattered. She set her pack down. She looked at the stove. He had kept it fed through the day. She said, "Thank you for the fire." He said, "How is she?" Nora took off her outer coat and hung it on the hook near the door. "Holding," she said. "The cold is getting to her chest more than her legs this year, which is harder to address than the joints. But she is not in immediate danger." She paused. "She is more frightened than she is admitting. Can you help with that?" "Some," Nora said. "I went back twice today. Stayed longer than I normally do." She came and sat on the floor near the stove, closer to the heat than she usually sat, which told him something about how far the day had taken it from her. "Her name is Margaret." She has been out here for 15 years. She was a teacher before that, in one of the river towns. She left after her son died and never went back. He looked at her. She did not often offer information about the people she helped. When she did, it was deliberately chosen. You care about her, he said. She is someone worth caring about, Nora said. She makes very good decisions. She knows a great deal about plants that grow in cold ground, and she has never once in 15 years asked anything of anyone that she did not actually need. He thought that this was possibly the highest compliment Nora was capable of giving someone. Do you need anything? He asked. She looked at him. Like what? I am not certain. That is why I am asking. She considered this in the way she considered most things, without performing the consideration. Tea, she said finally. If you can manage it without pulling the stitching. He stood carefully, because it still required careful, and he heated water, and found the leaves, and prepared the tea, with the method she had shown him on the second morning, which was not complicated, but which had a specific order to it, that she had demonstrated clearly, and which he had remembered. He brought it to her. She took the cup in both hands and sat with it, and closed her eyes for a moment. He sat back down and did not speak. He understood that she did not need conversation right now. She needed the warmth and the quiet, and a few minutes of not having to attend to anything. He gave her that. After a while she opened her eyes and looked at the fire. How was the day? Long, he said, but usefully long. I thought through several things I needed to think through. She glanced at him. Decisions? Some. Understanding. More than decisions. Did you reach any? He looked at the fire. I understand why it happened the way it did, he said. I had been not understanding it properly. I was looking at a small version of it, at the personal element of it, Gerald specifically, which was preventing me from seeing the larger structure underneath it. Today I saw the larger structure, she said. And I know what needs to happen. Not how yet, but what. She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when something made sense to her, but she was not sure yet what she wanted to say about it. The how will come, she said. Once you know what you are working toward, the how tends to arrive. He looked at her. Is that how it worked for you? She was quiet for a moment. She held her cup in her hands and looked at the fire. Yes, she said. More or less. He did not push further, but he noted the answer. She had, at some point in her own life, faced a what before she had a how. She had arrived at the borderlands after a process that had its own kind of difficulty, its own version of walking out a back door into the night. He did not know the specifics. He knew enough. They sat in the warmth of the shelter as the dark came fully down outside and the cold settled in around the walls, and the fire between them did what fire did, burning steadily and without complicated intention, giving off its light and its heat to whoever happened to be nearby. He felt, for the first time since the knife, something that was not quite hope but was close enough to it to matter. On the fifth evening, he told her the full story of the order that had started everything. Not because she asked. She had not asked, had maintained, through every day since finding him, the same principled restraint about the parts of his life he had not offered. She had listened when he spoke, and asked nothing when he was silent, and this was, he had come to understand, one of the most significant things she did. The silence was not absence, it was space. Space in which he could choose whether to speak or not, and the choosing was entirely his, and that meant that when he did speak, the words were real. They had eaten. The fire was lower than usual, because the wood supply was running short, and they had agreed without discussing it, to use it more conservatively. Outside, the night had come in sharp and still, the kind of cold that was not moving, but simply present, everywhere at once. The sky was clear for the first time since his arrival, and he had seen it through the gap above the door when she had gone to check it, before closing them in for the night, and the stars had been extraordinary, the kind you only saw far from everything built by people. He started with Gerald. He did not start at the beginning. He started at the moment in the meeting room, when he had felt the air in the room change, and had understood, 3 seconds before the knife, that what was about to happen was not the argument he had expected. He described it accurately, without drama, the way you describe a thing when you need someone else to understand it, rather than when you need them to feel something about it. Gerald's face, the quality of the silence in the room, the 4 men who stepped back. Nora listened. She sat with her knees drawn up and her back against the wall, her cup long since empty but still in her hands, and she listened with the full attention she brought to things that she had decided were worth her full attention. When he had been quiet for a moment, she said, "And the order. What specifically were they asking you to do to Owen Carr?" He told her, plainly, as he had told it to no one since it had happened, because there had been no one to tell it to. The Borderlands were not known for their supply of confidential listeners. She said nothing for a long moment after he finished. Then, they wanted to remove him from his records as well, not just his position. "Yes," he said, "everything. His record, his correspondence, the decisions he had documented over 22 years. All of it was to become part of a different narrative. One that justified the replacement, which would make his work invisible. His work, and the fact that the territory had functioned correctly under him. If there was no record of the correct functioning, there was nothing to compare the new arrangement against." She sat with this for a long time. He could see her thinking, not performing thought but actually doing it, the way certain people go genuinely quiet when they are working something out. "You refused," she said. "Yes." "Were you afraid when you did it?" He looked at her. The question surprised him, not because it was impertinent, but because it was the question he had not been asked by anyone who had known him in that life, and the people in that life would not have asked it. "A little," he said, "not the way I was afraid at certain points when I was younger, when fear was a large, unmanageable thing. This was different, smaller, more underneath, like knowing that a step you are taking is the correct one, and also knowing that the ground on the other side of it is not solid." "But you took it." "Yes." She nodded. "That is a different kind of courage than most people recognize," she said. "Most people think courage is the absence of fear, but you cannot be afraid of something that does not matter to you." The fear and the courage were together. He looked at her for a moment. "Where did you learn to think about things that way?" She did not answer immediately. She set her empty cup down on the floor beside her, and straightened her legs slightly, and looked at the low fire. He waited. "My husband," she said. He stayed very still. "He was the kind of person who thought clearly about things," she said. "Who could say the accurate thing about a difficult situation without reducing it? I learned a great deal from listening to him." She paused. "He died 6 years ago. A sickness that moved faster than anyone was expecting. He was 43. Callum said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be more than what the silence was already holding. "I had been happy," she said, "in the way someone says something they have looked at from a distance, long enough that they can describe it without breaking. Not in a way I was always aware of while it was happening. That is the nature of it, I think. You are inside it, and you are moving through your days, and there are problems, and there are frustrations, and there are the ordinary things that fill a life, and you do not necessarily name it as happiness. You simply are in it, and then it is gone, and in the absence of it you understand what it was." He looked at her profile in the firelight. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the fire, or at something beyond it, some distance that was interior rather than literal. "His name was Daniel," she said. "Daniel," he repeated. The name asked nothing of him. He simply said it back to her, as a way of receiving it. "He would have been the person I called," she said, afterwards, "when I did not know what to do or where to go. He was that kind of person. The one you call." She was quiet for a moment. "For about a year after he died, I kept almost calling him. It happened constantly. Something would occur, and my first thought would be, I need to tell Daniel this, and then the second thought would come and take the first one apart." She paused. "Eventually it stopped, or mostly stopped. I still have occasional moments, less often now." He held all of this carefully. "The Borderlands," he said. "Did you come here after?" "Not immediately," she said. "I went to some other places first. I tried to remain in the life we had built. We had a house in the river town, work I had done, relationships with people, the structure of a shared life. I tried to continue in it." She looked back at the fire. It was the wrong shape for me alone. The things that had meaning in it were either the things we had built together, which caused a particular kind of pain to continue without him, or the things that had been mine separately, which I had not paid enough attention to while I had the other kind. I stayed for 2 years, and then I understood I needed to go somewhere that did not have the shape of a life I was no longer living. He nodded slowly. "The Borderlands are good for that," she said. "As I told you, they do not care what you were before. Well, they do not require you to be that. They require you to be attentive and practical and honest about what you have and do not have. Those were things I could do. And the work you do here, the people you help. That came later, she said, after I understood the territory. There are people who live at the edges of things who cannot easily be reached by the systems that are supposed to reach them. I have means and knowledge and a route. It was a straightforward problem with a straightforward solution. What? She said. You describe everything as straightforward, he said, including things that are significantly less than straightforward. They become straightforward when you have done them long enough, she said. But there was something at the edge of her voice that was not quite argumentative. Daniel would have appreciated that about you, Callum said. The way you make complex things simple without taking anything away from them. She looked at him. It was one of those moments of quiet impact, where a thing said precisely catches a person off guard, because they were not expecting to be seen in that particular way. She did not look away, which he had come to understand was her version of the thing other people expressed through speech. He did, she said finally. He said almost exactly that, once. Callum nodded, and did not press further, because he could see that she had given him something real, and she did not need him to handle it heavily. They were quiet for a while. The fire burned lower. He thought about the shape of a life, built around a person, and what happened to the shape when the person was gone. He had not had that kind of life, not yet. Not the version that was built with another person at the center of it. He had had work and purpose, and the particular satisfaction of doing something well, and he had had colleagues he respected, and some he had thought were friends. He had not had what Nora was describing. He was not sure, until this moment, that he had understood exactly what he had not had. She stood to add the last of the dry wood to the stove, feeding the fire enough to get them through the night. He watched her do it with the efficient, practiced movements that were so entirely her, the way she did not waste motion, the way her hands moved without uncertainty. She sat back down. The warmth increased slightly with the new wood, and then settled into the steady level it had held all evening. "Can I ask you something?" he said. He caught himself immediately. "I know. You told me I do not need to do that." "Ask," she said. "Do you regret the borderlands?" She thought about it genuinely. "No," she said. "There are things I miss. There are things I would go back to if I could. But the borderlands are not separate from those things. They came out of them. I am not a different person out here. I am the same person in a different place, doing something the same person would do in a place that needed it." He sat with that for a long moment. There was something in it that applied to his own situation, and he was not yet sure how much he wanted to acknowledge that. "You are thinking about what you are going to go back to," she said. "Is it that obvious?" "You have a particular expression when you are thinking about it," she said. "Something around the eyes." He filed this away. He had not been aware of that expression. "I am thinking," he said, "about whether the thing I am going back to is the thing I actually want, or the thing I have been doing for so long that I have not looked at it separately from myself." She looked at him carefully. "Those are different questions." "Yes," he said. "The first one is about Owen Carr, which I am clear on. The second one is about me, which I am less clear on." She said, "You do not have to have the second answer before you act on the first." He looked at her. "No?" "The clarity about Owen is enough to move on," she said. "The clarity about yourself will come while you are moving. It does not arrive on its own, separate from action. You think yourself into it by doing." He looked at her steadily. "Is that what you did?" "Yes," she said. "I left the river town before I knew who I was going to be without it. I understood myself by walking into the place I needed to be." He thought about that for a long time, long enough that the fire had burned down almost to coals before he spoke again. "Nora," he said, "I am going to ask you something, and you can tell me directly, if it is not a question you want to answer." She looked at him. "When you found me," he said, "you did not know who I was. Did knowing who I was change anything?" "After?" She considered this. Considered it in the way she considered things she actually wanted to answer correctly rather than quickly. "It changed some practical things," she said at last. "The way I understood why you were in the borderlands. The scope of what had happened to you. The stakes. But not the essential thing." "No," she said. "Not that." He pressed his hand against his side. The stitching held, as it always held. "Good," he said quietly. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then looked back at the fire. and they sat in the warm, near dark of the shelter, and the night moved quietly around them, cold and clear, and full of stars, through the gap above the door that neither of them had thought to close. On the 6th morning, he woke before she did. It was the first time this had happened, and he lay still for a moment, aware of the reversal and its small significance. He had been, for 5 days, the person being recovered into the shelter, rather than the person already in motion inside it. Today something had shifted. He was awake before the light, before the stove needed tending, before the sound of water being heated, or jars being assessed on the shelf. He was awake and alert, and the pain in his side had moved from a daily reality into a background fact, something present but not demanding. He got up quietly and put wood on the stove and heated water without waking her. She was on her side on the far part of the cot with her coat drawn up, and he could see from across the small space that her face in sleep had the same quality of self-contained composure that it had when she was awake, that there was no version of Nora that was more vulnerable or more open than the version he already knew. She simply was what she was, and sleep had not changed it. He made tea the way she had shown him, and stood near the stove and held the cup with both hands, and thought. He had been here 6 days. He was not the same person who had come off that ground in the borderlands a week ago, which was partly a medical observation, and partly something else that he was still in the process of identifying. He had arrived with the specific kind of emptiness that came from having everything removed, not just position and safety, but the framework of meaning that surrounded them, the structure of days, the sense of being, where he was supposed to be doing the thing he was supposed to be doing. That framework was gone, and in its absence there had been, for the first 4 days particularly, a flatness that had nothing to do with physical weakness. The flatness was changing. He could feel it changing the way you felt a change in the weather, before it was visible in the sky. Something was coming back. Not the same thing, he did not think. Not the old version of himself moving through the old structure of days. Something different, adjacent to it but built from different materials, shaped by what had happened and what this week had added to it. She had added to it. He sat with that honestly. He had met many people in his life. He had spent years in rooms with people who were intelligent and capable, and who understood how to move within systems of consequence. He had respected many of them. He had liked some of them. He had trusted a smaller number. He had not, he now recognized, met many people who were what Nora was, which was genuinely without pretension at a structural level. Not modest in the way people perform modesty, but actually without the layer of self-presentation that most people maintained as automatically as breathing. She said what was true. She did what was needed. She did not explain either to make them more acceptable or more impressive. He thought about Daniel. He thought about what it must have been like to be married to a person like that. The particular gift of someone who loved you and who was also radically honest about what they saw. He thought about the loss of that and what it would do to you and how you would move through the years after it, and he thought that the borderlands made a certain kind of sense as the answer, a place that required honesty to navigate. A place without the elaborate social architecture that would have, in different circumstances, required her to perform a grief she was actually carrying. She woke in the middle of this thinking, and he did not know she was awake until she said, in a voice that was almost fully alert, "You made tea." "It is on the shelf," he said. "Still warm." She sat up and reached for it, without the usual preliminary stillness of waking, and he realized that the 2 or 3 minutes of that stillness, which he had observed every previous morning, was not a habit of waking slowly, but of waking before he did, and lying still while she oriented herself. Today he had removed that time from her. She had gone directly from sleep to awareness without the usual gap. "I apologize," he said. "I did not mean to alter your morning routine." She looked at him with the cup in her hands. "You did not alter anything. I simply noticed the fire was already going." "The fire tells you whether I am up before you?" She glanced at him. "Everything tells you things, if you are paying attention." He smiled. "How do you know when I woke?" "The wood you added was the second section of the stack, which means you had already started with the end pieces before you thought to add more, which means you had been up for at least 20 minutes before you started the fire." He looked at her. "You have been watching the wood supply." "I watch everything in the shelter," she said. "It is a small space. Changes are obvious." He considered the implications of this. Every morning he had woken to find her already in motion, already in the middle of something, and he had assumed she had simply woken earlier than him and gotten on with her day. In reality, she had likely been awake before him every morning and had been watching the subtle evidence of his recovery through small indicators he had not thought to consider: the wood, the water level, the position of the clay jars. "You have been monitoring me," he said. "Someone had to," she said, without any particular weight to it. He sat with this for a moment. "And what does the evidence tell you?" he said. "About where I am." She looked at him over her cup. "You woke before me, which means you slept through the night properly for the first time since you arrived. You got up without the deliberate preparation you have been using every morning, which means the motion does not require management at this point. You made tea correctly, which means your hands are fully reliable." She paused. "You are better, Callum. Not fully recovered, but well enough." He heard what was underneath the words. They had both been hearing it for 2 days, the approaching moment when better would mean it was time to move. He had been putting off naming it directly the way you put off naming something, when naming it would change the conditions of the present, which you were not yet ready to leave. "I should check the stitching," she said. "One more time." He stood and lifted his shirt on the left side. She came to him, and did what she had done every morning: the careful examination, the light pressure at the surrounding skin, the assessment of color and temperature. But today the assessment was shorter than it had been on previous mornings, because there was less to look at. The wound was closing well, the redness was gone, the hair thread was holding, and the edges of the wound had knitted toward each other, in the way that skin did when everything was going correctly. She sat back and looked at his face rather than the wound. "It is doing everything it should be doing," she said. He lowered his shirt. "When should the thread come out?" "In about a week," she said. "It can come out after a week. If you are moving before then, which I imagine you will be, you can find someone who knows what they are doing to remove it. Or you can wait. Or I can come back," he said. The words arrived before he had consciously decided to say them. He held them out in the air of the shelter for a moment after they had been said, not pulling them back but not pressing them forward either. She looked at him steadily. "Come back," she said carefully, "from where you are going." "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her thinking, or not quite thinking, considering, in the way she considered things that mattered. "That is a long walk," she said. "I know. And what you are going to do between now and then is not a small thing." "No," he said. "People will want things from you," she said. "People who agree with you about Owen Carr, and want their own situations improved, and will use your effort to advance their own. You will have to manage that carefully." He nodded. "I know how to manage it." "I think you do," she said. "But I am saying it because it is the thing most likely to complicate what should be straightforward." He looked at her. "You do still use that word." "Because it is straightforward at its core," she said. "The core of it is wrong, and you are going to make it right. Everything around that is just management." He looked at her for another moment, long enough that she would know he was looking, and he said, "When I come back, to return the stitching, and for the thread." She held his gaze without flinching or looking away, with the quality she had of being present in whatever moment was actually happening. "You would walk all the way back here for that." "Among other reasons," he said. The shelter was very quiet. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the morning was beginning in the way the mornings always began out here, without announcement, simply arriving in the gap above the door. She did not say yes, and she did not say no. She said, "A week from when you leave. If the thread is still in, do not leave it longer than that, because the skin will grow over it." He understood that this was Nora's version of yes, the practical instruction that contained the permission inside it, rather than stating the permission directly. He said, "I will need to know how to find this place from the other direction." She told him. She described the landmarks the way she described the territory, when she was being precise about it. The way the eastern tree line bent at the second rise, the rock formation that looked like 2 fingers from the south approach, the color of the grass at the edge of the property in late autumn, still green at the base where it was protected, which would serve as a marker when everything else was flat and brown. He listened and did not write it down, because there was nothing to write with, and he held it in the method he had learned for holding precise things, repeating it back to her once in full to verify accuracy. She corrected 2 details. He corrected them and repeated it again. Good, she said. He began to prepare to leave. There was not much to prepare. His coat, his boots, the few things in his pockets that had survived the 4 days before he arrived. She watched him do it and did not offer to help or to slow it down, which was consistent with everything she had done since the morning she had found him. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. She was standing near the stove with her arms at her sides, watching him with that clear, present attention she had. He said, "I am going to tell you something, and you can do with it whatever seems right to you." She said nothing. "I came off that ground in the borderlands," he said, "believing I had lost most of what mattered to me, and I had. I had lost the work and the position and the trust I had placed in people who turned out not to deserve it. All of that is true, and I am not diminishing it." He paused. "But I think I was wrong about what I had left. I think I arrived here with significantly less than I could see, and I am leaving with significantly more." She held his gaze. "What I have more of," he said, "is because of you. Not entirely, but largely. And I needed to say that plainly before I left, because otherwise, it is something I know, and you do not. And I do not like that asymmetry." She was quiet for a long moment. He could see whatever was happening in her. It was not visible on her face in any conventional way, but something in the way she was holding herself was different from a moment ago. Something had shifted in the quality of her stillness. "Go carefully," she said. Her voice was even, but the words were not. "I will," he said. He went through the door. He did not look back, not because he did not want to, but because some things were better served by a clean departure than a prolonged one. He walked south through the borderlands with the cold morning air around him, and the stitching steady against his side, and the landmarks she had given him turning over in his mind, in the order she had described them. A map he was carrying internally, a line that led from where he was going, back to where he had left. He would come back. He had not been sure of many things recently. He was sure of this. The territory did not wait for him. He had not expected it to. But there was a difference between knowing a thing intellectually and walking back into it and feeling it at close range. The situation had moved in the weeks since his exile. It had moved in the direction he had predicted, and in some directions he had not, and the first 3 days back were spent almost entirely in catching up with what had happened while he was gone, talking to people he trusted enough to talk to, gathering the pieces of a picture that had been reassembled in his absence by hands he did not choose. Gerald Wren had wasted no time. Owen Carr had been formally removed 2 days after Callum's exile, which meant that Gerald had already had the paperwork prepared before the meeting where he had put the knife in. He had simply been waiting for the obstruction to be removed. Owen himself had been relocated to a smaller settlement at the territory's edge, placed in a position that was technically administrative but practically invisible, stripped of the records and correspondence that were the foundation of his work. The men who had wanted his territory had moved in immediately. Callum learned all of this from a man named Henry Oakes, who ran a quiet operation that processed information through several layers of the Northern Territory, and who had, over the years, built a network that Gerald had underestimated, because Gerald had never taken Henry Oakes seriously. Henry Oakes was the kind of man who was easy to underestimate because he was quiet and precise and had no interest in impressing anyone, and the people who underestimated him consistently found themselves surprised by how much he knew. He came to Callum in a small house in the southern districts, at a meeting that had been arranged through 3 intermediaries and conducted with all the caution that the current situation required, and he set out what he knew, with the organized clarity of a man who had been waiting for the right person to tell it to. "You have people who want to help you," Henry said. He was a lean, careful man, with gray at his temples and ink on his left hand, which reminded Callum of something he had thought about in the borderlands, and did not have the full attention to think about now. Significant numbers. More than Gerald has accounted for, I believe. He made the calculation that removing you quickly would consolidate his position before resistance could organize. He was not wrong about the speed. He was wrong about the resistance. "How many?" Callum asked. "Enough," Henry said. "But they need you to move carefully. A direct confrontation, without the right support in place first, will be ugly and incomplete. If you move too soon, you have a partial outcome, which is worse than none." "I know," Callum said. "I am not going to move without the foundation." "What does the foundation require?" Henry told him. It was a list, not a short one, of relationships that needed to be confirmed, documentation that needed to be located and secured, witnesses to certain agreements who needed to be protected before Gerald's people recognized them as witnesses. It was the work of weeks, minimum. Callum sat with the list and the weeks it represented and breathed through the patience required. He had always been able to do this. He had always been capable of the long game, the kind of approach that involved accepting short-term difficulty for the integrity of the longer goal. He did not like it. Patience was never something he enjoyed for its own sake, but he understood it, and he knew from experience that impatience in this kind of situation produced worse outcomes than the delay it was trying to avoid. He set to work. The days were full in a way that was entirely different from the days in the borderlands, which had been full of nothing, and had given him that nothing as a kind of resource. Here the fullness was external, meetings and information, and the careful management of people who were all bringing their own needs and fears and agendas to a situation that already had enough complexity, without additional weight. He moved through it with the efficiency he had spent years building, and it worked. The efficiency worked. The conversations went the way conversations went, when the person conducting them understood how to read the room and adjust in real time. But something was different about him in those rooms. He noticed it first in the second week, in a meeting with a group of people who had lost significant ground under the new arrangement, and who were frightened and angry in approximately equal measure. He had handled rooms like this before. He knew what they needed, which was clarity and direction, and the specific quality of calm that came from someone who understood the situation and had a plan for it. He gave them all of that. But he also did something he had not done consistently before, which was to listen to the parts they were telling him that were not strategic, the personal parts, the way this had affected specific lives at a small scale. He found he was genuinely interested, not in the tactical sense of gathering information that would be useful. He was interested because those small-scale consequences were real, and they mattered, and he had spent 6 days in a shelter with a woman who operated entirely at that scale, who understood that the management of large systems was only meaningful if it touched the actual lives of actual people, and that understanding had gotten into him in a way he had not fully accounted for. He went home at the end of that day, back to the small rented room he was using while he worked his way back toward a more stable arrangement, and he sat at the table near the window and pressed his hand to his side. The stitching was still there. He had left the borderlands 8 days ago, which meant the thread had been in for 8 days beyond the original closure, and it needed to come out. He had said a week. She had said a week. He had meant to arrange for someone to remove it here, a physician in the southern districts whose discretion he had reason to trust. But the days had filled themselves and the specific errand had been pushed back each time, and now it was past the point she had described. He thought about the way she had said it. Do not leave it longer than that because the skin will grow over it. He thought about how much of the past week he had been thinking about her, not in a distracted or consuming way, in the way you think about a thing that has settled into a reliable place in your attention, always there when you look for it, not demanding but present. He had told Henry, on the second day, without fully intending to, that he had received unexpected help during his time in the borderlands. Henry had looked at him with the intelligent, restrained expression he used when he was receiving information he found significant, and had filed it without comment. On the 14th day, a message arrived through the chain of intermediaries Henry managed. It was a single sentence written in plain language on a folded piece of paper that had been through at least 4 hands before it reached Callum. The message said, "The woman at the Eastern Cache asks whether you are managing." He sat with this for a long time. The woman at the Eastern Cache. He turned this over in his mind, understanding that Nora had reached out through a channel she would have had to locate and use deliberately, through people she knew and was known by in the borderland territory, people who had connections into the area Henry managed, because the borderlands were not as isolated as they appeared, and Nora was not as disconnected as a person living in them might be expected to be. She had asked whether he was managing, not whether he had succeeded, not whether he had made progress, whether he was managing. The distinction was entirely characteristic. He sent a message back through the same chain. He kept it brief, as she would have. He said, "Managing well. Thread still in. Coming back soon." He arranged to come back in 3 days, having done enough in the first 2 weeks to justify a short absence, and having committed to being gone no more than 2 nights. Henry had looked at him with the same expression he used for information he found significant. Callum did not explain. He spent the 3 days before he went back doing what needed doing. He met with 3 more people on the list Henry had given him. He secured a piece of documentation that had been mislaid, which was a diplomatic way of saying it had been deliberately removed from where it was supposed to be, but not permanently. He had a conversation that was difficult but necessary with a man who had supported Gerald during the exile, and who now understood that he had made a serious error in judgment, and who was willing to say so in the right setting. The groundwork was progressing. The picture was forming. On the evening before he intended to leave for the borderlands, he sat in his rented room and thought about what he was returning to. He thought about the shelter in the hillside and the fire in the iron box and the specific quality of silence that existed between 2 people who were comfortable enough with each other to share silence without needing to fill it. He thought about Nora on the floor near the stove with her cup in her hands, looking at the fire with whatever she was thinking present in her face in a way that was not available for reading but was genuinely, unmistakably there. He thought about what he wanted to say to her when he got there. He had not been, in his life, a man who found it difficult to say things. He had spent years saying things clearly and deliberately, and the precision he brought to that had served him. But this was different. The things he wanted to say to Nora did not have the quality of things that had been prepared. They had the quality of things that were simply true, and the challenge was not finding words for them, but deciding how many words they required. He picked up the cloth she had put in his hand on the morning he left. He had carried it from the borderlands in the inside pocket of his coat. The small piece of cloth with the remaining strands of her hair wound inside it, the ones she had not used. He had not put it down since she had pressed it into his palm. He had not examined his reasons for this because some things, he had decided, were better carried than analyzed. He held it now and looked at the window and the dark beyond it and thought that in 2 days he would be standing in the borderlands again, with the familiar particular cold of that altitude against his face, and the thought had a quality that he had not felt about a destination in a long time. He was going somewhere that mattered. Not because of what it contained strategically, not because of what he needed to accomplish when he got there, for a simpler reason than that. He was going somewhere that mattered because the person who was there mattered, and he had not had that about a specific place in a very long time, if he had ever had it in quite this form. He put the cloth back in his pocket. In the morning, before Henry arrived for their day's work, he wrote a letter, short, 2 paragraphs, addressed to Owen Carr, at the settlement where he had been placed. He did not say everything in the letter. He said enough. He said that what had been taken was being recovered. He said to hold on. He said that an honest man's record was not destroyed by being moved somewhere no one was supposed to look for it, because the people who built that record still existed and would confirm it. He sent the letter through Henry's chain. Then he sat at the window in the early light and breathed and pressed his hand very gently against his side and waited for the day to begin. He had a week's more work ahead of him before the situation would be stable enough for the final move. He had a 2-day absence coming first. He had a woman in the borderlands who had asked whether he was managing, through a chain of people she had found because she wanted to know. He was managing. He was doing more than managing. He was beginning to understand, for the first time in years, what it would mean to have a life that was not only about what he was working toward, but about where he was when he was not working. He had not thought about that in a long time. He was thinking about it now, and the thinking felt like the beginning of something he had not had a name for, and was beginning to need one. He came back in the middle of the week, as he had said, and the borderlands received him the same way they always received visitors, which was without ceremony and without adjustment. He knew the route from the south now. He had the landmarks she had given him and he had memorized them correctly, because they led him through the landscape with the specificity she had intended, the bent tree line at the second rise exactly where she said it would be, the rock formation to the left precisely as she had described it. He moved through the territory with better strength than the first time, and the cold was the same, and the yellow grass was the same, and the sky was the same hard winter gray, but he moved through it differently than he had the first time. The first time he had been losing ground with every step. Now he was covering it. He did not announce himself. There was no mechanism to announce himself, which was partly by design. The shelter was built to be unobtrusive, and the approach to it was not marked in any way that would guide a person who did not already know the route. He came through the last stretch of the slope and reached the door and stopped. He knocked, which felt slightly strange given that the shelter had no windows, through which she could assess who was knocking, but which also felt like the only correct thing to do. She opened the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. For a moment neither of them spoke, and then she stepped back from the door to let him in, and he came inside into the warmth of the stove, and the familiar low light, and the smell of the place that he had apparently memorized without trying to. Dried herbs and wood smoke, and the particular quality of clean air that existed only in places where the world outside was very large and very cold. "You look better," she said. "I am better," he said. She gestured at the cot, and he sat, and she crossed to the shelf and began, without asking, to prepare to check the stitching, taking out the small things she needed for it, and arranging them with the same efficiency she always used. He watched her hands. He always noticed her hands. "The thread needs to come out," she said, without looking at him. "I know. That is why I am here." "Is it?" she said. It was not quite a question. He said, "Partly." She turned to look at him then, with the direct, unadorned attention that was so entirely her. "How is the work going?" she said. He told her. He gave her a version that was precise and honest, not more detailed than it needed to be, and not simplified below the point of accuracy. She listened and asked one question, which was about Owen Carr and whether there had been any contact, and he told her about the letter and what he had said in it. She said, "He knows you are moving." "Yes. That will matter to him," she said, "the knowing, even before anything is resolved." He thought about her saying this. She had never met Owen Carr. She had no direct connection to the situation in the Northern Territory, but she understood it the way she understood most things, which was by cutting through to what was actually happening at the human level, and naming it accurately. Owen would have been afraid in his relocated position, afraid that the record he had built was simply going to disappear into the new arrangement, and no one was going to do anything about it. Knowing that someone was moving would not resolve that fear, but it would change its quality. It would become something you could hold, rather than something that was pulling you under. "Yes," he said, "I thought so too." She moved to him with the needle and the small thread she used for the removal, which was different from what she used for stitching, finer, and with less drag. She crouched beside him, and he lifted his shirt, and she examined the wound site before she began. It was the best it had looked since she had first seen it. He could tell that from her face. The satisfaction she kept out of her expression consistently was present around her eyes today, in the small way she did not quite manage to suppress. The wound had done exactly what it should. The hair thread had held through everything, through the walking and the weeks of activity, and the days of meetings where he had been more physically present and active than he should probably have been with an 8-day-old closed wound. "I am going to start at the end, closest to the hip," she said. "It should not hurt much, but it will pull." "I know," he said. She worked with the same care she brought to everything. He breathed and looked at the lantern on the shelf, the same lantern that had been there on the first night, and thought that he had now had two significant experiences by its light. One of beginning something and one of completing it, and the completion was the one that was somehow more affecting, because it meant the thing that had been done in the beginning had held through everything that came between. He felt the pulling she had described, a series of small, precise tugs, as each stitch was released, not painful but present, requiring him to stay still and trust the hands doing it. He trusted the hands doing it completely. She finished and sat back. She looked at the site, and then at his face. "All out," she said. "The wound has closed on its own. The thread did what it was supposed to do, and then the tissue took over. You will have a scar." He said, "I know." "Not a large one," she said, "but visible." He said, "I know that too." She sat back on her heels. He lowered his shirt. The pulling sensation had already faded, and what was left in its absence was a kind of lightness he had not expected, the absence of something he had carried for weeks, an awareness of the stitching against his skin that had been so constant he had stopped registering it, as distinct from the normal awareness of his body. Now it was gone, and his side was just his side. He pressed his hand to it anyway. Habit, by now. She was still crouching near the cot, looking at him. He looked back. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. He said, "I spent the past 2 weeks doing work that I have done variations of, for most of my adult life. Meetings, information management, the careful movement of pieces into positions that make the larger position possible. I am good at it. I have always been good at it. But I was doing it differently this time. How? She said. I was paying attention to different things, he said, to the actual lives inside the situation, rather than only to the situation itself. It changed what I asked, and what I heard, and what I did with what I heard. He paused. I do not think I would have been doing it that way without the week I spent here. She looked at him carefully. That came from you, she said, not from me. It came from being in the same space as you for a week, he said. You do not need to deflect the credit. I am not giving it to you as a compliment. I am telling you what I observed about the mechanism. She sat back fully onto the floor and wrapped her arms around her knees, the posture she adopted when she was thinking about something that required more than her standing attention. He waited. I sent a message, she said, through the chain. I received it. I was not sure I would, she said. The chain is usually reliable, but it is not designed for specific personal messages. It is designed for practical information. Henry Oakes manages it, Callum said. He is reliable about everything. She looked at him. You knew who ran the chain. I found out, he said. When your message came through, Henry told me he had received it from the Eastern Cache. I understood then that you had connections in the territory that I had not fully appreciated. She was quiet for a moment. I have been here 6 years, she said. The people I help are connected to a great many things. I did not build a network. I built relationships, but relationships connect. He nodded. Yes. He looked at her. Why did you send the message? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, because I wanted to know. And because I thought you might need to know that someone was asking. He sat with this. The second reason was characteristic of her, thinking about what he needed rather than what she wanted. The first reason was something different. He said, Nora. She looked at him. He said, I am going to finish what I started. It will take another 2, possibly 3 weeks. And then I want to come back here. Not to return thread or check stitching. For a different reason. She held his gaze. He said, I understand if the borderlands are not where you want a different reason. I understand if the different reason is not something you are looking for. I am not asking for an answer right now. I am telling you what is true for me, so that it is not a thing I know, and you do not. She was very still. I know that you had something complete, he said, that you and Daniel had something complete, and it was taken from you, and you built a life from the space it left. I am not asking you to do what cannot be done. I am not asking you to try to make the same thing twice. I am saying that something happened between the first night and the last morning, and it happened to me. And I believe it happened to you too, and I would like the chance to understand what it is. She looked at him for a long time. The fire breathed. The shelter held its warmth around them. Outside, the cold borderlands did what they always did, which was exist without agenda, simply there, simple and wide and requiring nothing. She said, something happened. He waited. She said, I noticed it, and I put it somewhere I was not looking at it directly. He said, why? She thought about this genuinely. Because you were leaving, she said. And putting it somewhere I could see it while you were still here, and about to leave, seemed like a particular kind of difficulty I did not need. He understood this. He recognized the specific economy of it. And now? She looked at him. She did not look away. She said, now you are here, not leaving yet. He sat forward on the cot. No, he said, not yet. She uncurled from the floor and sat on the edge of the cot beside him, not close but beside, the way two people sit when they are being honest with each other about something that matters, and do not want the distance of having a room between them. She looked at her hands, which were on her knees. Then she looked at him. I told you about Daniel, she said. Yes. That is not something I tell people, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him with that clear, direct look. When you come back, she said, after it is done, come here first, not anywhere else, here. He nodded once. Here first, he said. And bring enough time, she said, not 2 days. How much time? She thought about it. She looked at the stove and then back at him. Enough to have a conversation that does not need to end before it is finished, she said. Whatever length that requires. He said, I can manage that. I believe you, she said. They sat beside each other for a while, in the shelter that she had built herself. and that had held him through the worst of what he had come through, and the fire was warm between them, and the cold was outside, where it was supposed to be, and neither of them felt the need to say anything that was not exactly necessary. He left before the dark came in. She walked with him to the edge of the slope, which she had not done the first time, and stood at the rise with her coat around her while he started south. He did not look back this time either, but he knew she was standing there. He carried that with him all the way to the southern districts, the knowledge of her standing at the edge of the slope, watching the direction he had gone. Gerald Wren made 3 mistakes in the final 2 weeks, and any one of them would have been sufficient. The first was moving too quickly against a group of small landholders in the eastern section of the territory, who had been slower than expected to fall in line with the new arrangement. He had sent men to pressure them directly rather than working through the administrative process, which was both legally indefensible and practically stupid, because it left evidence at exactly the point in the territory where evidence was most likely to be gathered by people who were already gathering it. The second mistake was believing that the men he had positioned around him in the weeks since the exile were loyal to him rather than to the circumstances he represented, and that this loyalty would hold when those circumstances changed. It did not. When Callum's people began quietly confirming the record of what Gerald had actually done, and the shape of it became clear to the men Gerald had assumed were committed, several of them discovered that their commitment had been to a specific version of the arrangement, and not to the man who had assembled it. The third mistake was not checking the eastern cache. Henry had been routing information through points in the borderland territory for years, and Gerald's people, even after 6 weeks of trying to understand the full scope of the network, had missed several of them. The eastern cache was one of those misses. The confirmation of certain agreements, the original documentation of what Owen Carr's 22 years of administration had actually produced, the testimonies of people who had direct knowledge of the events surrounding the exile, all of it had been passing through channels that Gerald had not located, and by the time he understood this, the pieces were already in place. On a cold Thursday morning, 24 days after Callum had left the borderlands, the formal request for review was submitted to the oversight body that Gerald had assumed would be managed in his favor, and which turned out, on this particular morning, to be less manageable than he had believed. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no confrontation in a room full of people. There was no public declaration. Callum was not present for it, having arranged for the submission to be handled by people whose standing in the process was cleaner than his own, because he had understood from the beginning that the goal was not to be seen to win, but to ensure that the correct outcome was produced through the correct process. He was in his rented room in the southern district when Henry sent word. The word arrived simply, 3 sentences. The submission had been received. The review would begin within the week. Gerald Wren had been asked to step back from his position pending the outcome. Callum read it twice. He sat at the table near the window for a long time. He did not feel the surge of satisfaction he might have expected. He felt the clean, settling weight of something that had been wrong, beginning to be corrected, which was a different thing entirely, quieter and more durable. Owen Carr would be told today. His record would be reinstated as part of the review process. The men who had benefited from his removal would be examined, and the examination would not find them innocent, because they were not innocent, and the evidence was now organized in a way that said so plainly. It was not done, but it was begun, correctly, and Callum had done enough to ensure that the correct beginning could not now be undone. He wrote to Henry, brief, direct. He said he was leaving for several days, and that the next phase of the process could proceed without him, and should, because the process was now better served by people whose standing was uncompromised, and his involvement would only complicate it. He said he was available for whatever was formally required, and would be reachable through the usual channel. He packed a small bag. He had thought, as he packed, about what he was bringing, and what that meant. He had never in his life packed specifically to go somewhere he wanted to be, rather than somewhere he needed to be. The distinction was subtle but real. He checked through it twice, not because he had forgotten anything, but because the act of packing for a place he wanted to reach had a quality he wanted to be present for, to notice properly, rather than move through on the way to something else. He left before the morning had fully arrived. The route south and east was familiar to him now. He had walked it twice in both directions, and it had taken on the quality that routes take on once you know them. Predictable in the best sense, the ground telling you the same things it had told you before. He walked at a pace that was comfortable rather than urgent, which was possible because he was no longer working against a wound or against the exhaustion of several days without shelter or food. He was simply walking toward something. He reached the borderlands at mid-morning. The yellow grass and the cold sky and the bent tree line at the second rise. He moved through it with the landmarks she had given him and arrived at the last stretch of slope at a time when the thin winter light was directly overhead, a gray diffuse light that was not warm but was honest about what it was. He knocked on the door. She opened it. She was wearing the same dark green coat he had seen her in every morning, and her hair was loose, and she looked at him with the clear attentiveness she always had, not surprised exactly, but fully present, in the way she was always fully present when the moment actually had something in it. She stepped back. He came inside. "Is it done?" she said. "Begun correctly," he said, "which is what needed to happen." She nodded. She moved toward the stove and he followed, and they sat as they had sat every evening in the week of his recovery, close enough to the heat to benefit from it, and across from each other, at the angle that came naturally to both of them. "Owen?" she said. "Being told today," he said. "He will know before the day is out." She held her cup with both hands, and looked at him with the evaluating look she had when she was taking stock of a situation. "You look different than the last time you were here," she said. "How?" She thought about it. "Lighter," she said. "Not the same as when you arrived," which was a specific kind of lightness that was exhaustion and relief mixed together. "This is different." He said, "It is. The other kind was the absence of something terrible. This one is the presence of something else." She looked at him carefully. He said, "I have been thinking for 24 days about what I want the rest of my life to look like. Not the work of the next few months, the actual shape of things, longer than that." She waited. "I want to keep doing the kind of work I do," he said, "but differently than I have been doing it. I want to be the person who actually understands what the large decisions are doing at the small level. Not just in the abstract, but because I am in enough contact with the actual lives to know." He looked at the fire. "I have been in rooms making decisions about the lives of people I never met, and I believed the distance was necessary. I no longer believe that." She said, "What changed it?" 6 days in the borderlands," he said, "and a week of watching someone who operates entirely without that distance." She looked at him. He said, "You know what you are doing, Nora. You know the names of the people and the specific ways they are struggling, and what they actually need, as opposed to what a general policy would provide. You know Margaret's chest is worse this year, and what that means for how she needs to be helped specifically. That knowledge is not incidental to the help. It is the help." She held his gaze. Something in her had shifted slightly, the way she shifted when something landed in the right place. He said, "I want to learn how to work that way. I am not saying I should be doing what you do. I am saying I should bring what you do into what I do, and I have been thinking about what that would require." "It requires presence," she said. "Time. You cannot do it from a distance, and you cannot do it in a hurry." "I know," he said. "I am reorganizing accordingly." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "Nora." She looked at him. "I told you before I left that I was going to come back for a different reason. I am here for that reason now. The thread is out, and the work is begun, and I am here because I want to be here, and because the last time I sat in this shelter, I realized that the last time I had been somewhere I wanted to be was also in this shelter." She sat very still. He said, "You told me something happened. I am asking what you want to do with it." She held his gaze for a long moment, in the way she held things that mattered, fully and directly. Then she said, "I have been thinking about what I told you about Daniel." He waited. She said, "About how he was the person I would have called, the one whose name was the first thought in the moments that mattered." She looked at the fire and then back at him. "I have been thinking about the morning you left. I watched you go south, and then I came back in, and I did the morning the way I do it, and I put the stove right, and I started the day, and approximately 4 hours later, something happened on my route, something small, nothing that required another person, but my first thought was, I want to tell Callum this." He sat very still. "It was the second time I had had that thought about a specific person since Daniel died," she said, "and both times it was the same person." He looked at her. She looked at him. The shelter held them in its small, warm, honest space, and the fire was going, and the cold was outside, and everything in the shelter was exactly what it was, without pretension or decoration. He said, "Nora." She said, "I know." He said, "I am not asking for something complete. I am not asking for anything more than what is true right now, which is that I want to be in the same place as you, and I want to understand what happens when I am. That is all I am asking for." She said, "That is not a small thing." "No," he said. "It is not." She looked at him for another long moment, and he held that look, did not flinch from it, did not try to shape it toward an answer he preferred. He let it be what it was. She said, "You said bring enough time." He said, "I did." She said, "Did you?" He said, "I have no fixed obligation for the next week." She turned the cup in her hands once. She said, "Margaret needs checking tomorrow morning. That will take 2 hours." He said, "I will be here when you get back." She looked at him. He said, "I can keep the fire." Something crossed her face that was not the near smile he had seen before, the small contained movement at the corner of her mouth that she mostly managed. This was different. If this was the full version of it, quiet and real and not managed at all, and it arrived on her face and stayed there, and he sat and looked at it and did not look away. She said, "All right." She said it simply, the way she said everything that was true, and decided, "All right." 2 words with the weight of an open door in them. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and put the small piece of cloth on the surface between them, the one she had pressed into his palm on the morning he left. The cloth with the remaining strands of her hair wound inside it, the ones she had cut and not used. He had carried it for 24 days without setting it down. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said, "I kept it." She picked it up with both hands, the way she held things she was taking the full measure of, and she sat with it, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The fire moved between them with its small, steady warmth. The borderlands were dark by now outside the door, cold and wide and full of nothing that asked anything of either of them. He was where he wanted to be. He understood, been moving toward this without knowing where it was. Not the position or the restoration of what had been taken, though those mattered, and he would see them through. This specific warmth, this specific person across from him, in the light of a stove she had built herself in the side of a hill in the borderlands, turning a small piece of cloth over in her hands, with the same care she brought to everything. He had lost a great deal and found his way here. He pressed his hand to his side where the stitching had been. The skin was smooth and healed, and marked with a scar that would stay for the rest of his life, and underneath it, his pulse was steady, and present, and sure.